The morning of October 25, 1944, opened like a trap door in the Pacific, revealing a nightmare that no one aboard Taffy 3 expected to survive. In the faint glow before sunrise, the sea around Samar shimmered with a deceptive calm. Only a soft breeze, the gentle sway of swells, and the low hum of escort carrier engines heading east. But that illusion shattered at 0646 when a lookout aboard USS Johnston spotted ghostly shapes materializing through the haze. Dark, towering silhouettes stretching across the horizon like a moving mountain range of steel. The Japanese center force had arrived. Led by Admiral Takeo Kurita, this armada, battleships Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, escorted by heavy cruisers like Chikuma, Tone, Suzuya, and Kumano, represented the last massive strike force Japan could bring to bear in the Pacific. Their mission? Tear through the American landing force at Leyte Gulf. Yet instead of encountering battleships or fast carriers, the Japanese now faced 6 small escort carriers, floating airstrips with paper-thin armor, and a meager screen of 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The imbalance was almost laughable. Taffy 3 had no heavy guns, no armor, no torpedo bombers ready, and aircraft armed mostly with depth charges for anti-submarine patrols. And then came the first thunder. Huge columns of water erupted near White Plains and Kalinin Bay as Japanese gunners opened fire from over 20 miles away. The sky flashed with orange spear points of distant cannon fire. Commander Ernest E. Evans, captain of USS Johnston, stepped onto the bridge without hesitation, scanning the distant fleet marching toward them like an unstoppable storm. With his black hair whipping in the wind and his jaw set hard, he delivered the line that would define not just him, but an entire battle. A fighting ship cannot run from the enemy. Around him, young sailors, some barely 19 years old, felt a chill of purpose. They knew what he meant. They understood what he was about to do. The Johnston would not retreat. She would charge directly into the jaws of the greatest battleship ever built. And every man on board suddenly realized they were about to write a chapter of history paid for in blood and fire. Evans did not simply order an attack. He unleashed a force of will so fierce it seemed to electrify the ship itself. The Fletcher-class destroyers surged forward, engines roaring, as he pushed the throttles to flank speed, while the escort carriers turned away to flee under a blanket of desperate smokescreens. The Johnston pointed her bow directly at the Japanese line. Imagine it. A 2,100-ton destroyer, thin-skinned, lightly armored, charging straight toward battleships weighing over 70,000 tons. Water erupted around her as gigantic shells crashed into the sea, some so large the shock waves vibrated through the decks like earthquakes. Sailors at the guns gritted their teeth, ignoring the spray of shrapnel and stinging saltwater. Assistant Gunnery Officer Robert Hagan shouted range corrections to the crew. Range, up 100, fire,
Johnston's 5-inch guns cracked again and again, their recoil shaking the ship as shells hurtled toward the cruiser Kumano. The Japanese gunners, stunned by the audacity of a lone destroyer charging them, temporarily shifted fire to Johnston, giving the escort carriers precious minutes. But Evans wasn't finished. As Johnston closed within 10,000 yards, he prepared for the move that cemented his legend. Stand by torpedoes. Sailors swung the port side launchers into position, bracing against the violent roll of the ship. Under fire from heavy cruisers and battleships, the deck itself vibrated as fragments ripped into the railing, slicing small shards of steel into nearby crew. Yet no one broke, no one faltered. Evans waited, eyes locked on Kumano's burning bow. At the perfect angle, he gave the order, fire. 10 Mark 15 torpedoes streaked into the sea, their wakes glowing like white scars across the water. Seconds later, observers saw a massive eruption tear open Kumano's bow, severing 30 feet of steel, forcing the cruiser to withdraw. Johnston turned sharply, weaving through near hits that towered over the ship like collapsing sea pillars. The Japanese weren't just confused, they were rattled. A single American destroyer had just stabbed their formation and lived. Taffy 3, outnumbered and outgunned, had a fighting chance because Johnston had drawn first blood in the most impossible of battles.
But Johnston's defiance also drew the wrath of the most terrifying weapon afloat, the battleship Yamato. At 0730, observers aboard the Japanese flagship identified Johnston not as a destroyer, but as what they assumed must be a cruiser, because no destroyer would dare charge a fleet head-on. Yamato's fire control officers calculated the range. The main battery, 9 enormous 18.1-inch guns, slowly rotated toward the tiny American ship, each barrel longer than Johnston herself was wide. When Yamato fired, the ocean responded like a living thing. The air cracked, the seafloor trembled. A pressure wave slammed into Johnston, lifting her slightly before dropping her back into the swell. The shells landed close, too close, throwing up plumes of water that fell like rain on the deck. But the second salvo didn't miss. One of Yamato's monstrous shells smashed into Johnston amidships, ripping through compartments with catastrophic violence. Steam lines burst, machinery screamed. Men were thrown across the deck as if hurled by giants. The aft engine room went dark, flames spreading across the broken casing. Evans was thrown off his feet, blood pouring from a cut above his eye. But before anyone could help him, he pushed himself up and roared, "Back to your stations. We're not done." With radar destroyed, the ship blinded by smoke, and speed reduced, Johnston seemed doomed. Yet the destroyer turned again toward the enemy. The communications officer, with radios wrecked, used a handheld megaphone to relay orders across the decks. Gunners manually sighted their weapons, tracking muzzle flashes through drifting plumes of smoke. Johnston's 5-inch guns, cracked and overheated, kept firing. Japanese destroyers that attempted to close the distance were forced to scatter under Johnston's unexpected counterattacks. Sailors later recalled that despite being hit by the largest naval gun ever used in combat, Johnston fought like a creature possessed. The ship was battered, bleeding,
but still swinging, still refusing to back down, still buying precious minutes for the escort carriers trying to escape.
The battle off Samar devolved into utter chaos. Torpedoes streaking in every direction, smoke drifting across the sea like torn curtains, and Johnston right in the center of the storm. Japanese cruisers fired salvos that walked toward the American line like footsteps of doom. Yet Evans continued to maneuver his crippled ship through impossibly narrow gaps. Torpedo wakes flashed under the surface, crossing so close to Johnston that sailors could feel the vibration through the deck. From the escort carriers, aircraft scrambled into the sky, some armed only with depth charges, others with no weapons at all. Pilots flew low, diving on Japanese ships to distract them, sometimes firing pistols out of cockpit windows or dropping wrenches onto enemy decks. Taffy 3 was throwing everything into the fight. Meanwhile, Johnston pressed on. The ship's forward turret, hand-loaded by exhausted sailors whose arms trembled from strain and heat, pounded the cruiser Chikuma. Each hit knocked out enemy guns, forcing the cruiser to peel off. Smoke screens laid by American destroyers drifted across the water, giving fleeting glimpses of silhouettes firing blindly into the haze. It was a battle where instinct replaced calculation, where courage stood in for armor, where improvisation shaped survival. Shrapnel rained down on Johnston, shredding railings, tearing through bulkheads. Fires spread. The sky itself seemed to glow red from the constant gunfire. Yet the ship's crew, bleeding, burned, deafened, kept pushing. Damage control parties sealed bulkheads with whatever they could find. Ammunition handlers passed shells by hand down dark, flooded corridors. Even the ship's cook carried wounded sailors, then returned to help load shells. In those moments, Johnston ceased to be a warship. She became a heartbeat, a living symbol of resistance. The men aboard knew they weren't just delaying the Japanese, they were reshaping the outcome of the entire Philippine campaign.
As the battle raged, Johnston's mission became brutally clear. Shield the escort carriers at all costs. Japanese cruisers shifted their fire toward Gambier Bay, the only carrier too slow to outrun them. Her thin hull shuddered under repeated near hits. Seeing this, Evans ordered Johnston, already crippled, to interpose herself between the carrier and the oncoming cruisers. It was a decision so reckless and heroic that survivors struggled to explain it years later. Fires raged through Johnston's interior. Flooding advanced along the starboard side. Speed was dropping. Yet the destroyer turned directly into the path of Chikuma and Tone, firing with every gun that still worked. Johnston's shells repeatedly smashed into Chikuma's superstructure, damaging her rudder and knocking out gun turrets. The Japanese gunners, frustrated and astonished, shifted fire to the persistent destroyer biting at their heels. Shells ripped into Johnston's forward deck, blowing men into the air. But she kept firing. Even aircraft from Taffy 3, some with no ammunition, made dry attack runs to add to the confusion. One pilot wrote later, "We were out of bullets, so we just kept diving, anything to buy them another minute." Gambier Bay fought as long as she could, but eventually succumbed. Yet survivors later testified that had Johnston not shielded her so aggressively, most of her crew would have been lost before they ever reached the lifeboats. Men aboard Johnston could see Gambier Bay rolling over, hear her crew shouting as they entered the water, but they had no time to mourn. Evans, gripping the shattered railing on the open bridge, shouted new orders even as flames roared below him. Johnston was breaking apart, but the battle was not finished, not as long as she still had one working gun. Now, the Japanese destroyers closed in, eager to finish the crippled American ship that had humiliated them. Johnston's speed had fallen to a crawl, barely 15 knots, her engines coughing and sputtering as seawater seeped into wounded compartments. Ammunition was nearly gone. The aft guns were flooded. The forward turrets could only fire manually, each shell lifted by exhausted men whose bodies ached with every movement. Yet, when several Japanese destroyers angled in for a final torpedo run, Evans did the unthinkable. He ordered Johnston to charge again. With barely enough power to steer, the ship lurched forward like a wounded beast, refusing to die. The Japanese opened fire with dozens of guns at point-blank range. Shell after shell tore open the hull, ripping away entire sections of deck. Still, Johnston advanced. The forward gunners, covered in soot and blood, kept firing until their hands blistered from handling overheated shell casings. Remarkably, one of Johnston's salvos struck a Japanese destroyer so hard it forced her to break off her attack, an almost impossible achievement for a dying ship. The American sailors cheered, even as flames roared behind them. But the cost was staggering. Another broadside smashed into the starboard side, sending steel fragments flying like shrapnel from a grenade. Steering failed entirely. The ship lurched violently to port, nearly rolling from the last blast. Men struggled to stay upright as structures collapsed around them. Water surged through ruptured bulkheads. The list increased steadily. But even as Johnston's body failed, her spirit remained untouched. Evans, bloodied, uniform torn, continued directing the fight until the roar of collapsing steel drowned out his voice. And still, the men refused to yield. By 0940, Johnston was mortally wounded, but no one aboard was willing to accept it. Japanese ships, now firing at near point-blank range, sent shells slamming into her hull with devastating accuracy. Fires swept through compartments unchecked. Water rose knee-deep in corridors once used for routine drills. Men stumbled across slanted decks, slick with oil, trying to bring ammunition to the last surviving turret. Machine gunners, their belts almost empty, fired at fleeting shadows through smoke. A Japanese cruiser passed so close, survivors later said they could see individual sailors manning her guns. Still, Johnston kept firing. Still, she answered every blow with a defiant flash of flame. Then came the salvo that broke her back. A Japanese cruiser unleashed a barrage that ripped open the forward hull, blowing men across the deck. The sea surged inside, the keel groaned, the destroyer shuddered violently under the force of the impact. Evans tried to steer the ship manually, gripping the broken wheel with bleeding hands, but the controls no longer responded. "We did all we could," one sailor whispered. "Captain kept us in it as long as any man could." Yet Evans refused defeat. Through smoke and chaos, he moved to the railings, shouting to his men, urging them to fight on, reminding them that every second they held out was another second the carrier survived. It was a defiance so fierce, so unwavering, that even Japanese reports later acknowledged Johnston's courage. The sea raged beneath the dying ship. The sky thundered with gunfire. But Johnston, broken, burning, sinking, still fought.
At 0958, the inevitable order finally came. Abandon ship. Yet even then, many sailors hesitated, looking back at the ship that had become their shield, their home, their identity. The deck was tilting dangerously, seawater rushing over the starboard side and spilling through shattered hatches. Men helped each other into the oily water, clinging to floating debris or half-inflated rafts. Some were badly wounded, barely able to move. Others clung to each other to stay afloat. Oil slicks covered their faces, making it difficult to breathe. As they drifted away, they searched desperately for Commander Evans. Some claimed they saw him helping wounded men onto rafts. Others believed he was blown overboard earlier in the fight. But as the ship rolled onto her side, no one could locate him. At 10:10, USS Johnston slipped beneath the sea, her bow rising briefly before the ship plunged into darkness with a final hiss of steam. Survivors, bobbing in the water, watched her vanish with a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. The battle still raged in the distance, but Johnston's part was over. She had stood against battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and prevented them from overrunning the American landing force at Leyte Gulf. The ocean carried the cries of the wounded, the crackle of fires, and the fading thunder of guns. Some Japanese ships passed close by. A few even fired on survivors. Others simply steamed past. The men clung to life as the hours stretched in unbearable agony, hoping rescue would come before darkness or sharks claimed them. Johnston was gone, but what she had done was beyond heroic. It bordered on impossible.
Survival after the sinking became its own brutal battle. For nearly an entire day, the survivors drifted across the Pacific, wounded, burned, dehydrated, many slipping in and out of consciousness. The water was slick with fuel oil, coating their skin and burning their eyes. Some men vomited repeatedly from swallowing it. Others fought to keep their heads above the waves as exhaustion dragged them downward. Sharks circled constantly, drawn by blood and wreckage. Sailors lashed themselves to floating debris or formed small groups to keep each other awake. Some hallucinated vividly from dehydration. Others sang to stay conscious. A few recited prayers for hours. When distant aircraft finally spotted them late in the afternoon, the men cheered weakly. But rescue wouldn't arrive until much later, as other emergencies took priority across the battered American fleet. Through the night, men clung to life. Some slipped beneath the waves quietly. Some died in their friends' arms. Some ranted in delirium, imagining they were back on deck, still firing at the Japanese. When rescue ships finally arrived more than 24 hours after Johnston sank, only 141 of the 327 crew survived. Their testimonies stunned Navy investigators. They recounted Evans's refusal to retreat. They described Johnston charging battleships. They told of torpedo runs made under fire so intense the sea seemed to boil. Many could barely speak through tears as they described their captain. He was the bravest man I ever knew. Survivors said the entire ship fought with the same heart. From the engine men who died at their posts to the gunners who kept firing until the guns physically jammed, every sailor aboard had lived a lifetime of courage in 3 extraordinary hours.